let's look at our academic innovation the same way that I would look at something that a client brought me at Back Bay, right? I have this thing, it could do many things. What is the most capital efficient way to value creation?
This is the Nucleate Podcast, the voice of the next generation of biotech leaders.
Welcome to the Nucleate Podcast. My name is Sam Kessel, and I'll be your host. On this episode, I have a conversation with Dr. Michelle Hoffmann, Executive Director at the Chicago Biomedical Consortium. The Chicago Biomedical Consortium, CBC, is a Midwest Center of Excellence for Biomedical Translation that nurtures academic discoveries into high-impact startups. Embedded within 9 Illinois universities, it provides industry-grade experience and know-how, coupled with patient capital at the earliest stages of drug and diagnostic development. CBC's vision is to build a flourishing biotech ecosystem by identifying promising technologies and funding key de-risking activities, training the next generation of entrepreneurs to anchor founding teams and connecting teams to sources of capital. The CBC bridges the critical gap between academic research and industry application, a vital link for building a dynamic ecosystem. In her time as executive director, Dr. Hoffmann has reorganized the CBC to train local PhD talent in the business of early science commercialization, while developing a process to find and fund the most promising biopharma applications of Illinois University science. Prior to this role, from 2019 to 2021, Dr. Hoffmann was the Senior Vice President of Deep Tech at P33, a privately funded nonprofit charged with elevating Chicagoland's innovation economy and driving inclusive economic growth. Hoffmann spent 15 years helping life science companies grow, most recently as a senior vice president at Boston-based Back Bay Life Science Advisors, an integrated strategy and investment firm to global life science companies and their investors. Hoffmann earned a PhD in molecular and cellular biology from the University of California, Berkeley, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Brandeis University. On this episode, we speak about the Entrepreneurial Fellows Program, which opens on March 20th and closes on May 2nd, 2025. Links to the CBC website and application are included in the podcast description. I had a wonderful time speaking to Michelle, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us on the Nucleate Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with your background. Can you tell us about what it was like growing up and what inspired you to ultimately get your PhD in molecular neuroscience?
Great. What was it like growing up? What do I like to say? I was always the smartest kid, and everywhere I went. If I had to say what was my childhood like, I am the child of an academic. My father was a math professor, so I definitely wasn't the smartest person everywhere I was. But I think what I did get was a natural, or my father cultivated my natural curiosity, but also my natural skepticism, right? There's nothing like a math professor to say, prove it. So why did I end up where I end up? As I like to say, mostly because I was interested in something at the time, but also because when I was growing up, I also come from an academic family. Cousins get PhDs and uncles are professors and that type of thing. You can do whatever analysis you may want, but my husband is a professor. And that wasn't supposed to happen, by the way. But anyways, so I was always interested in something. And I think I got interested in biology probably in college, and walked into a lab and loved it. It was where I wanted to be. I loved the fact that you could just ask questions and answer the questions, and you could pose more questions. I was so people say, oh, well, you did your bachelor's and then I worked for a little bit in a lab and then I went to graduate school and then I did my postdoc. I actually switched around a lot. So I was a microbiology major as an undergraduate and I was really interested. I became very interested in sort of how bacteria can actually achieve different functions at high cell density. So you have these unicellular organisms that can do complicated things when they need to and at the right density. And so I started to become really interested in cell-cell communication. And so I was like, oh, I feel like I've gotten what I needed to in the prokaryotic world, you know, let's look at development because that's really where, you need coordinated communication between cells to achieve different functions. And I thought I was going to study that in graduate school, but then I got interested in different model organisms and specifically C. elegans, but then neuroscience, because C. elegans have a very tractable nervous system. And, if you're interested in cell-cell communication, there's nothing like a neuron that does that. So I wasn't a traditional neuroscientist. Like I wasn't interested in the brain per se. That came later. I was just really interested in how cells communicated with each other. And then also, what I will say, and this is shout out to Josh Kaplan, who I think is now at MGH, but I didn't, when I met him, he was at Berkeley, and that's where I did my PhD. It wasn't just the subject. And I say this to everyone, like the quality and your degree of satisfaction in your PhD will be based on the PI who runs the lab. And Josh was just the most amazing PI. So that was a big reason why I decided to study what I did, is he was just, you know, just a great, wonderful mentor, a wonderful scientist. He ran a great lab. It was an exciting place to be. And that is how I got into molecular neuroscience.
And really appreciate all the color on that. So it's interesting that, your dad fostered a really logical approach to thinking in you from a very young age. And it sounds like really set you up for success for how you think about, biological problems. It's just a certain way of thinking and coming from a very academic family. I find that interesting. And one thing that you're saying that we do hear a lot is that you had a general interest in, science and biology, but it was really a nonlinear path for you to get to your
Very nonlinear.
PhD. It was not a, decision from 5 years old that you were going to get your PhD in molecular neuroscience. You honestly didn't come to neuroscience in a way that most people do. It's interesting to me that you came about it from the molecular side, that you were interested in a certain biological process, and then neuroscience being kind of the ultimate extension of that interest, rather than saying, I love the brain, I want to learn everything about the brain. That I find interesting.
Hmm. Yeah. A random walk, if you will.
And I think a lot of us resonate that. Certainly I do as well. So after your PhD, you did a postdoc and ultimately pivoted into biotech and consulting. Can you tell us about that decision and how that worked out?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it was so, did a great postdoc at Brandeis with Gina Turgiano, who is just an incredibly creative thinker about the brain, and I learned so much there, especially since if you talk to any neuroscientist and you're like, so I study C. elegans, it has 302 neurons, right? You get kind of laughed out of the room. And Gina was my attempt to become a true neuroscientist. Um, so what I found is that I was getting kind of higher up and learning a little bit more about what it took to actually run a lab and a research program. And what I learned was that it was more solitary than I would have wanted. One of the reasons why I loved my PhD, it was incredibly collaborative lab. Um, I think even when I was applying for postdocs, I would get dinged sometimes with the co-first authorship. And I thought that was, I mean, I was young, so I thought everything was ridiculous. Um, but I thought it was an amazing strength, right? Somebody doing the quantitative aspect, somebody doing the biophysical aspect, somebody doing the molecular aspect. Like it just made sense. And then there were always these great people to bounce things off of. As a postdoc and starting to really think about what I would do to build my own lab, it was much more solitary. And there are a lot of things that went into it. It wasn't just one thing, but I think I felt like my happiest was when I was in a team environment solving problems. And I looked at a number of science positions where I could potentially do that. And for a variety of reasons, they just weren't open to me. And there wasn't biotech at the time. I'm old. This was 2003, four, I can't remember, something like that. So there really wasn't a lot of biotech in Boston. And um, and so I wanted to try something different. And consulting is one of those areas that's really open to PhDs. It's very, and I know many people have this same frustration, right? They get somewhere in their PhD or their postdoc and they realize that they don't want an academic career. And to be honest, what do they call it now? A non-traditional academic career. Well, like almost I can't remember what the statistics are, but it's not a ton of PhDs go into the traditional, R1 university run a lab anymore. They still call it a non-traditional career, which kind of irks me. But unfortunately, what happens with your PhD is you have all this training and you learn all these things, and you will often be the smartest person in the room. And at the same time, when you're trying to apply for jobs, you are placed out of many jobs, right? You're overqualified. They also look at you and they're like, well, you're in the 32nd grade. So that is why consulting is one of those few places where they'll take you because they're like, you know how to think and etc. But even that was really challenging at the time. So I ended up taking a job at a small firm, a competitive intelligence firm that I think very few people had heard of. And again, non-traditional, non-canonical, not the normal way, but why do that? And it was also pretty amazing. Like I learned a lot. So that's how I got, and then from there I went to multiple places. But that's how I got into consulting.
No, that's really interesting that the main driver for you was that you wanted to spend more time in teams, working collaboratively. Really interesting to hear that it was a ding against you to have co-first author
Hmm.
papers. But I think that kind of says a point around how you approach things, that you value that teamwork, that you have the best insights when you have different perspectives in the room working together.
I'm a thinker out louder. And what I want is I want to say something with extreme confidence. But maybe not the most accuracy. And I want smart people around me to be like, shoot it down or make it better. And that has been the best times of my career. That's eventually how I found my way into Back Bay, right? That was also just a phenomenal environment as well.
Yeah, and I want to get to Back Bay in a second.
Hmm.
I'm curious. So you were in your postdoc.
Hmm.
You were feeling like, hey, I want something more collaborative. How did consulting come up? I think, especially to your point, back in, early 2000s, maybe it was less common
It
for
was a lot less common.
PhDs to make the leap to consulting. Although I've considered consulting, pretty much a retreat for academics. It's fairly common path now.
Sure. Yes,
How did
very.
that even like come across across your desk, a potential consulting job? How did that come into the fore?
Like I said, I mean, I'm just one of these people that like gets interested in things. Just just get interested in things. How do things work? Like that is just me. And so at Berkeley, I ran because I was like, I wasn't. I mean, I was interested in biotech. I think that was one of the reasons why I got into biology. I was like, well, you can change DNA, and if you can change DNA, you can make anything. How do you do that? And obviously, this was, late 90s, early aughts. So, it's not that easy then. But I was really interested in, what are the different careers? And I ran a career seminar thing at Berkeley, and we brought in all these different types of people, and they talked about what they did. And that's when and where I learned about consulting. And uh, at the time it was like, McKinsey and BCG, which again were the major outlets at the time. But if you didn't, make it to their, and they were one of the few places that would take PhDs. So I knew about that. And I just kept networking and networking in when I was in Boston to make sure I could find a place that would take me and that I could learn. And that was doing the types of things that I wanted to do, which I couldn't quite articulate then, which is why I highly recommend networking and informational interviews, which I think makes a lot of people that sit in that sort of crossroad, shake with fear. But I actually learned, like, I very much found the value of informational interviews because it allowed me to say, listen, consulting is anything. What type of consulting do I want to do? What are the problems that I want to deal with on a daily basis? What do I want to learn? And that was really, really important because there's so many different kinds of consulting firms out there.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. So consulting is often, how do I put this? It's confusing for people, right? There's a lot of buzzwords around consulting, and truthfully, a lot of different consulting firms do very different things. So, curious if you can explain a little bit more about what did you actually do as a consultant, and most of your consulting career was spent at Back Bay Life Sciences. So it'd be good to explain
Yep,
beyond the buzzwords, as I'll
sure.
call it, what were you actually doing for your clients?
Okay. So number one, Back Bay doesn't call itself a consulting firm. And for some reasons, we call ourselves strategic. Well, I'm not there anymore. It's hard for me to remember that. It's been a while, but I'm like, they're a strategic advisor. So this is the way that I usually explain it, right? Consulting just means you're consulting, right? It's like saying I'm a worker. You're consulting. And so what kind of consulting do you want to do? It's really helping businesses work. So you can do strategy consulting, which is how people think about McKinsey and BCG and Bain. And there's so whenever I get interested in something, I just like go and I read books. There's actually some really interesting books about the dawn of consulting and how it came from what's his face, 80 Little. And it really was an outgrowth of all of these quants that came into the Second World War and trying to figure out, how much ordnance to drop on a particular city. It's basically taking a very quantitative and scientific approach to warfare. And then it got transformed into business in the post-war era. There's a book called The Lords of Strategy, I think, and it's about BCG and sort of the rise of those guys. There's also the House of Lies, how management consultants steal your watch and tell you the time. There's some really good books on it. But ultimately, right, consulting is helping businesses. And like I said, so there's strategy consulting. This is what people typically think of. It's really sort of the tip of the spear. But then there's operational consulting. And at the time that I was getting into consulting, it was actually right after the dot-com boom. And so there was a lot of IT consulting. And that's actually like, and I think what people have to understand is like businesses, consulting follows so many different flavors. And so by the time I was interested in getting in consulting, what was happening is that consulting firms realized that they could use strategy consulting to get into a large company, but then it was really the IT consulting, implementing these large systems that would earn them a lot of money. And McKinsey actually started dipping their toe in that water, but then there was a contraction. So that's when I entered. So there's operational consulting, IT consulting, there's strategy consulting, and I did sort of straight strategy consulting at Capgemini, and I went with a group to help found a firm that didn't quite work out. And that was just very much strategy slash operational consultant, where we would also do project management. And so I learned a lot about how pharma companies run, how they're organized. Not as much about the science as I wanted, but very much about how do you actually build a commercial organization and how does a commercial organization run. I am a scientist. I will always be a scientist. I'm a scientist by training. I like the science. I like getting in the nitty gritty. And so it wasn't really till I got to Larynx Swan in 2007 that I was like, oh God, I found my people. I don't have to keep explaining to people that, I'm the egghead or whatever it is that they think I am. And that was a very different kind. So they called themselves strategic advisors. And to some degree it was consulting, but not exactly. And the reason why is that Jeff Leerink and Leerink Swan was actually, I think, a pretty very innovative idea. Jeff Leerink was one of the first people to understand that, biotech and healthcare, there was a ton of expertise around that just wasn't being accessed. And he started the whole idea of really developing an expert network to help with you know, uh, uh, strategic transactions, to help with investment banking, all of those different types of things that biotech and healthcare could be knowable. And so they built a strategic advisory group. And it was the idea that you would be able to use that knowledge to help with corporate strategy, which for a lot of early stage biotechs is their product strategy, is their product development. And that's what I loved. Like I fell in love with it because we were supposed to interface with investment banking because the idea is you figure out what the corporate and the product strategy is, and investment bankers help you really understand how to get the capital you need to fuel that strategy. But it wasn't until Jonathan Gertler, brought us all to Back Bay that I feel like we implemented that in a way that just was amazing. And Back Bay has obviously done quite well. But we called ourselves strategic advisors because a lot of what we were trying to do was actually get to the point where we could even help broker a transaction. And so it's slightly different, and we kind of held the line at calling ourselves consultants or stop short of calling ourselves consultants because we said, we're actually implementing what it is that we advise, which I think has always been the knock on consulting, right? Like that's a great strategy. Now go and try and implement it. And so I'll just say, that was why, because what I had to do at Lyric and then at Back Bay was really dig into the science, every aspect of the science down to even if you're early stage and preclinical, would you be able to actually develop a product clinically and from a regulatory perspective? I just was happy as a clam, and I don't know what the right analogy is. I was quite happy there.
That's great. So can you give us some examples of the types of projects that you do as we'll call it strategic advising at Back Bay and as a consultant at Leerink Swan, just to give our
Mhm.
audience an understanding of
Sure.
what was the work that you did and the value that you added as someone with their PhD?
Yeah. So I'll say like in general, the way that we would caption it is that we help companies understand the value of new technologies in new areas of medicine. And so a good example, or at least okay, fun example, somebody is X million dollars in, right? The investors have put money into an asset and it has failed and they are out of money and out of patients. What do you do with it? Right? Like the science, the clinical program, it's all been developed for a particular area. What is the most capital efficient way to get the investors the exit that they want? Um, so that was probably some of the first projects or like the sort of cutting my teeth projects that I had at Back Bay, for example, where I think we were kind of really getting to the transaction. And it was building on projects that I had done, let's say at Leerink, where, somebody has a technology and the board wants to know how long it's going to, or what would be the value of that technology if they get it to the next development point, which is kind of what was our bread and butter at Lyric.
That makes sense. So a lot of what do we do from the scientific perspective with this asset, and then linking that to the clinical part. What diseases can you do? Can you treat with the asset? Um, what does this mean from a value perspective? If you achieve, a preclinical result that you're targeting or a clinical result, what does that mean for the company, for the investors, and overall that bigger picture? So really having to understand, the science, the business of how does biotech work, how many patients are going to be treated with the product, and how are they benefiting from it, and what does that mean on the commercial side in terms of what is that worth to payers, investors, etc.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so at Lyric, and we did these projects at Back Bay too, a lot of times what would happen is, and so, somebody wants to acquire a distressed asset, for example, and they want us to say, is this a good idea? Like kick the tires on it, right? And so you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, uh, if you put and I explain it to my fellows a lot of times. It's like flipping a house, right? You're in the right neighborhood. You should probably put two bathrooms in it. If you put more expensive fixtures in, you're going to lose your shirt, right? This is what you need to do to get to the valuation that you want and actually make money for your investors.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like your scientific background
Mhm.
allowed you to really think critically about those assets and about those problems and come up with a reasonable solution.
So I'll also say, and this is something that we try to emphasize, and we'll talk about our fellows program as well. And this is what I tell PhDs who are really interested in trying to get into this work. The scientific background is excellent and it's very, very useful. But you actually really have to learn a lot from a clinical perspective. And I think that's someplace. So and you can comment on this. I think physicians sometimes struggle when they're really going down to the foundational science and saying, okay, what can you do with this particular mechanism and what implications does that have? But if you don't understand how a particular patient is being treated, how decisions are being made by a physician, how decisions are being made by insurance companies, whether you're in the hospital or outside the hospital, how care is delivered in the United States and in Europe, it's actually really difficult to do these types of projects. So what I got at Lyric and then over my time, and this is another reason why it was, again, getting the right group together, is I was a basic scientist. Jonathan Gertler was an academic vascular surgeon who had wandered into this arena. We had him and investment bankers and pharmacologists, right? Putting us all together, I learned so much about how different groups think. And that is vital when you are thinking about biotech, which I say, academic science is about kind of that single solitary genius in a lot of ways that's running a lab and their vision. But drug development is a team sport, and you need so many different contexts and perspectives.
And then it goes to the point that you talked about earlier that having those intersectional experiences and interactions can result in, something really impressive when you're working with a big cross-functional team, someone with basic science, someone with clinical medicine, someone with business, and sounds like through your experience in consulting, you got a lot of exposure to all three.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, we'll talk about it soon, but that's one of the ways that I've built our fellows program, right? Is what I say is if you want to be at this intersection, you have to understand everybody's different contexts, right? That, your chief medical officer is going to be thinking differently than your chief scientific officer, which is going to be thinking differently than your regulatory people and compliance. And so you need to understand where all of these people are coming from and what their different, how they think, what their concerns are, because all of those things are necessary as you develop biotech.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess bottom line for our audience, we'll talk about the Entrepreneurial Fellows program in a minute. We know you recommend that. But for folks who are considering consulting, do you think it's a solid path for someone with a PhD who wants exposure to biotech? I consider it, a broad exposure to a lot of biotech business, so it has its place. But curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm I can talk some smack about consulting. And I think a lot of it is because we would get called in after sort of a large big box consultant or brand name or what have you. If you don't understand the business, you can write really nice strategy decks that are just absolutely unimplementable. And I think that is the big criticism that consultants get. And even as somebody who, I would say, even though we called ourselves strategic advisors, we were in client services. And we understood I understood very keenly that operational companies were spending their precious dollars to get us to tell them something that, they're like, okay, tell me something I don't know and tell me how to fix this problem that I have been thinking about for a very long time. And I think so you want to so the short answer is yes. Consulting is a great place to learn. But you need to understand what is the point of your consulting firm? What are they doing? And depending on who they are and what their fee structures are and their cost structures are, they will be doing different things. For us, we made a good living or Back Bay made an excellent living consulting in a fee for service model, but our bonuses and everything were based on transactions. And so our, our bread and butter was could you implement our recommendations? And I think you really need to think about that. What type of skin does your consultant have in the game?
Got it. Well, no, that's really, really helpful because it's a question that comes up a lot from folks in, the nuclear community is should I do consulting? So yes, but caveat, who are you working with? What are you doing? Sounds like a good learning experience for you,
It,
but there are other options, of course.
yeah, and I mean, I think it's also like venture, right? We get this all the time, right? So scientists are really good analysts. They love it, right? That's the part my fellows like the most a lot of times. And they can analyze anything. And that is where venture also becomes attractive. But I always tell my fellows, go get operational experience first, right? And then go into venture because, being able to analyze something is great, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to execute and operationalize. You need to understand what those pain points are. And I know that that is easier said than done. And so I don't fault anyone who says, you know what, it's easier right now to go to a consulting firm and learn a lot there and then go be an operator, but always have that in the back of your mind.
Well, it's interesting that the operational experience is valuable in venture too. And that's certainly something we learned in our previous podcast with Peter Barrett, longtime operator before he went over to Atlas Venture.
100%. And I will say, like, one of the things that I think, it hasn't just been the fact that Back Bay did transactions and really put their money where their mouth is or got their money where their mouth was. Um, I think it was also that I helped start that company and build it, right? That I got a lot of operational experience. You get a lot of operational experience when you have to hire people, you have to train them, you have to do all of the things to keep an organization together and float. And then also as we grew. So that was invaluable experience as well.
Great. So moving on from Back Bay and Boston, you moved to Chicago to work at P33,
I
which is
did not move it. So this is the common thing that I have moved to Chicago to work at P30. I did not.
oh,
I I like to say there's always a man. And that is why I moved to Chicago. My husband got a job as a
okay.
professor at the University of Chicago, and I moved there in 2012, but there was no biotech there. So I stayed in my job at Back Bay and I flew back and forth for 7 years. So I lived in Chicago and I worked in Boston. And actually, it's interesting. There are still a few people that I meet that do the same thing. They live in Chicago because they love it. But then, the biotech opportunities, some of them are outside. And that's what I did. And so I came to P33 because I was tired of flying back and forth for 7 years. And it was incredible to me that Chicago didn't have biotech. And I was offered the job at P33 to help build in Chicago. But I had lived in Chicago for 7 years before I actually started working there.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that. So
Uh,
that's a
Everyone
long
thinks that.
time to be doing a commute from Chicago to Boston. I mean, not that long of a flight, but if you're doing it regularly for work, I can see why that would be very challenging. So it's interesting. You said that you were surprised that Chicago didn't have more biotech. I mean, from my understanding, there's, AbbVie there. Maybe there's some other pharmas there. Certainly medical device firms I know are based in Chicago. So curious, what do you think the gap was, going back to that time that, Chicago didn't have that ecosystem?
Yeah. So Chicago is huge in pharma. And in fact, one of my first projects at Capgemini was at Takeda Pharmaceuticals North America, in Lincolnshire, Illinois. So there's a rich tradition of pharma in Chicago, really in the suburbs of Chicago. So that's Abbott, which is now Abbott and AbbVie, Baxter, Hospira, Takeda, plenty of other companies. I think what happened was, and I say this because of somebody who um, kind of lived through this whole transition, is there was a transition in the aughts, and I'm old enough to remember this, right? Like, so in the aughts, there wasn't biotech, right? So I mean, there was, but not the way we think of it now. I mean, I think Avastin in 2004 was like a game changer. It was a biologic that was for cancer that proved a supposed molecular hypothesis that was put forth by Judah Folkman. And that I remember was one of the biggest splashes that there was. Uh, and there were biologics before that, of course, but I feel like that was one of the first, like, and we had like a lot of the anti-inflammatories, the rheumatology biologics as well that were starting to gain ground around that time too, like Enbrel and Remicade and that type of thing. But that was really, really new. And when I started in consulting, it was a lot about big pharma and big pharma and this was the era of like the huge sales force. Uh, and I think what happened was that there was a transition from large pharma to more science-based biotech. And that really was happening on the coast and especially in Boston. And I think it was really Genzyme that started that push for real. And as the patent cliff came up, the fact that people didn't want these very large commercial organizations anymore. Pharma sales forces were having a much harder time accessing physicians. The idea of having a science-based cell, the idea of having these smaller, leaner organizations that would have these high science products that just basically sold themselves because, they were wonder cures. I think that transition was part of why, Boston started kind of ascending. And to some degree, not from an economic perspective, but certainly from an innovation perspective, Chicago was slower to move there. That's what I remember at the time.
And that's a really interesting history. And I mean, I know that Chicago has some fantastic universities, University of Chicago, Northwestern, where you're involved with all of those. So it sounds like the innovation scene in Chicago is very good. It was just that kind of, let's call it, early stage company formation part that seems to have been missing. That was kind of established in Boston, probably because of Harvard and MIT, if I had to put my finger on it. And, a lot of VCs that kind of got built in Boston early on.
I
So curious
think,
your perspectives on that.
yeah, I mean, now and I have not done a thorough case history, but what I will say, what I remember at the time, right, because I was working there, right, like, sure, MIT and Harvard are great and they have great people, but I do think there was a huge risk-taking culture. And I remember these companies, I'm not like I wasn't instrumental in them in any ways. I'm more like Candide, right? Like I was there, where, we would call on Vertex and they were in some ridiculous hovel in Cambridge with like stuff coming down the ceiling, right? This is before they had anything commercial or Millennium or um, uh, Biogen, right? Like there was a lot of risk-taking culture, and I think it's not just the innovation in the universities. I think it is the cultivation of that type of entrepreneur slash scientist, like, well, why not? Why shouldn't we do this? That was there, and they had some of the capital, et cetera, to push that forward. And then I'll also say, I do think the 2008 recession was a huge um, watershed event. I was at Lyric at the time. Nobody had any capital. But then I think, places like Atlas and Third Rock and those kinds of groups did have capital. And they were putting it in these sort of crazy, like, what? That's never gonna, like, what? What are you trying to do? That's crazy. And I think that was the next wave. And actually, if you look, a lot of the value creation that happened in biotech happened with that 2009 vintage. And I think that is, it's just sort of a combination that had been building, that people were like, why the hell not? That capital was at the right place. And I also want to say, and this is something that I try to bring to say, let's build biotech in Chicago, right? It's really that idea of a lean biotech. And I'll go back to like Atlas's company creation model as, a key, it's just a very key cornerstone in how I think about things. This idea of the, prove it and then scale it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And is that part of your thesis around, the Chicago Biomedical Consortium? Love to learn more about,
Mm.
how much you reference Atlas's model, how you're applying the learnings from Boston into the Chicago biotech ecosystem.
Let me be very clear. I do not have Atlas's money. So um, definitely partake of their ideas. I think one of the greatest things about Atlas is Bruce Booth and his oh God, what's it called again? His blog. Life Sciences BC. I should know that, right? Um, so how do I think about it? So the way that I think about it is that, and again, remember, we started Back Bay right after the recession as well. A lot of the companies that we were advising and we structured were virtual and lean. And the observation that you don't need a large footprint to build biotech. There are a lot of CROs, and they can be a lot cheaper than building lab space and hiring the staff to do it yourself. So it's really this idea that if you take kind of what Bruce Booth writes about he has a specific post in 2019, and it was referring to something before, and he calls it the company creation model, where the idea is that you take something in stealth mode, you take what for them is a small amount of money, but what for us is a large amount of money. You validate the science in stealth. You kick the tires on it. You see if you can find a management team, and you do market tests with your friends and say, is this a good idea? And in those couple of years, you're really spending money very wisely to say, Do you have a there? And I think that academic scientists need the exact same thing, right? They need validation, they need a plan, and they need execution of that plan, like establishment and execution. And that's, not to sound like it's really ridiculous if I'm like, I'm going to take the CBC and I'm going to turn it into Atlas. I don't have their money and I don't have their connections, but I think it is exactly the right way to think about academic de-risking. And that is what we need to do. Now, the money that we use, much smaller than what Atlas has, it's very patient capital. We know that we will use money that will not return. It's non-dilutive. We're philanthropically and federally funded, but that gives us the advantage of saying because our goal is economic development in Illinois, that we will use non-dilutive and very patient capital because the return is the economic development rather than the actual return on investment at the time. But yes, very similar sensibility.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're applying that model, even though you are a, like you're saying, philanthropic organization, but the key principles of how to de-risk early
Exactly.
stage innovation applies in the same way.
Exactly that.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the CBC? And you already explained really well how you help early stage ventures develop, but curious about your vision more broadly about building an ecosystem in Chicago. It sounds like you have the raw materials in terms of great innovation, some larger companies as well, but curious how you're kind of filling that gap to help build more nimble companies in between that.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I would say that I got recruited in 2019 by a great guy, Brad Henderson, to come to a privately funded economic development organization, P33, to help build life sciences here in Chicago. And the great thing about it was that it was chaired by Penny Pritzker, who is enormously influential and very dedicated to building Chicago. And she had been Obama's Secretary of Commerce. And I think she came back to Chicago and she's like, I saw all these places that are just really taking off in terms of tech innovation, but Chicago is not. Why is that? And P33 was built to address that issue. So what I did at P33, because I didn't know anything about economic development, which clearly doesn't stop me from doing anything, right? But I learned a lot about it, right? I learned a lot about, how do you actually develop a innovation ecosystem? And, people always say you need three parts of stool. You need capital, you need innovation, and you need expertise. But I think there's more than that, right? It's how do you actually get that working in a way that is virtuous. And when I joined P33, I was the only PhD on staff. And what I wanted to do was life sciences. And we really parlayed that into what we call deep tech. And I had to explain to people that, not all of tech is SaaS and not all of tech is, Uber, but for your dogs. That there's a lot of tech that's predicated on IP that comes from the universities and it will not be revenue generating for a long time. But the way that you build value is by having the expertise that initiated the IP associated with it. And what you're spending your time doing is de-risking. So that's the thing that I really championed at P33. And I learned, how to talk to different people about that and explain, because I'll tell you something, when I lived in Boston, like when I lived in Somerville, Mike Capuano was our congressman, and he was, as Somerville, and this is before Somerville was cool, as Somerville could be, but he knew everything about biotech, right? Like, because that is really important in Massachusetts. That is not the case in Illinois, and is not the case in Chicago. It's an incredibly diversified economy. And life sciences and pharma and biotech is just one of many different industries. So that was the other thing that I learned, right? That this is something that requires a lot of education. So I used or I learned a lot of those principles. I really understood the lay of the land, and I actually did a lot in terms of quantum, which actually, if you are ever interested and you can't sleep at night, Illinois is poised to become the leader in quantum information science and technology. And I like to say it was quantum before quantum was cool. And I cut my teeth on that, but I am a life scientist at heart. And so when the position at the CBC became open, I said, there's a thing that was actually just kind honestly too academic, but it was a great platform. And I said, I will take what I have learned in economic development and all of my past career, and I'm going to bring these ideas to the CBC. And what we are going to do is we are going to really mix up the milieu between what happens in academia where the IP is generated and what happens outside of academia where the IP is developed. And that was really the starting vision of the CBC. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No, that's really helpful to understand. Now, when we're talking about the programming that CBC is doing to, achieve this vision of helping build more biotechs in Chicago, can you tell us about just broadly? We'll touch on the entrepreneurial fellows, I promise, but just at
Sure.
a broad level, what that means, like what the types of programming that you do broadly, how that all fits together into the vision of building more biotech and life sciences companies in Chicago.
Yeah. So the CBC is the Chicago Biomedical Consortium, and we were really founded by a pioneering professor at Northwestern, Rick Morimoto. And he did it in concert with the Searle family. And it was really the vision way back in, I think it was even 2004, that in order to build an ecosystem here, and again, this was before biotech was in its ascendancy, but if you want to do something like that, you have to get the universities to work together. It's just a very different geography here in Chicago and Illinois than it is in the Bay Area and in Boston. It was really about funding great science and collaborations and etc. But that was for basic science. And in 2016, the family decided they wanted to go a slightly different direction. And they were like, this is great. You guys have been doing this great. Now we want to fund translations. And it was not constructed the right way. They brought a great guy here to run this new iteration, but trying to do this in the universities is very hard. It's not just an Illinois thing. It's hard in Boston, right? It's just you have more shots on goal. And so they brought me in to kind of shake it up. So take this academic really grant making organization and turn it into something that could be change making and transformative. And so my vision was let's modernize. Let's look at our academic innovation the same way that I would look at something that a client brought me at Back Bay, right? I have this thing, it could do many things. What is the most capital efficient way to value creation? And obviously, there are a ton more unknowns at the level that we're working at with the universities. But it turns out that there are still a ton of methodologies that you can use to evaluate and de-risk. And that was the vision that I brought in 2021 to the CBC, that we would use our funding to build a service that works with academics in a way that brings industry and venture sensibilities embedded into academia to help people start thinking about this before companies are formed, which I think is where it's critical.
And it sounds like approach that you use, leveraging experience from Back Bay Life Sciences and thinking about de-risking gives people who are reviewing technologies a structured approach, classic consulting, a structured approach to rigorously review science and figure out how can you approach it and translate it into something meaningful. And really, to your point, take an organization that was focused on academic grants, and how do you turn this into something more translational in terms of the science itself, moving it from the bench to the bedside, but also building companies, because ultimately, nonprofits are not able to independently fully scale an idea from that early translation all the way through clinical trials and
Yeah.
commercialization.
But Sam, wait, there's more. So definitely that was a vision, but I could not do it on my own. Going back to it's a team sport. So it's not just me. I brought in incredibly talented woman, Liz McMath, also a scientist by training, and I found her at Novartis Avexis, where she was doing search and evaluation for cell and gene therapies. So she helps, or not helps, but she basically designed our evaluation process, because that is something that she is amazing at. And then was lucky enough to bring in another guy, Eric Schiffauer, also a pharmacologist scientist by training. And he was Deerfield's liaison to Midwestern academic campuses for their, what's it called? Oh, God. Deerfield Drug Discovery. So DD3, I think it's what it's called. Um, and he can ferret out a good program that has potential, and he understands how to build a development plan that will get it from, let's say, if we're very lucky, or usually it's target validation to lead up, right? And I think it's really being able to look at this in multiple parts, right? So I bring in my understanding of how VC and strategics think about value creation and de-risking, Liz with her commercial analysis, as well as understanding development programs and things like that. And then Eric with his ability to design a development plan. And I think I like to say we are the largest concentration of early stage biotech expertise that exists in any university in the US that is free to professors.
And that's excellent that you provide that service, to the point it's philanthropic, and to the theme that we've talked about throughout this episode is you learn better working with teams, and you can achieve more when you have different people offering different perspectives where they're sharing their expertise.
Right. And then I'll just say, right, this is where the entrepreneurial fellows come in. Like, we are very good, but we don't scale. And what we need to be able to bring in young people, train them on what we know, right? Train them for an extended period of time, and then set them off into the ecosystem so they can take what they've learned. They can take, maybe if some of these early stage assets move forward, they can take them and build companies. And the idea then is that we have developed a cohorted, networked group of young people that have been apprenticed to us that will develop the ecosystem.
Yeah, so broadly, can you tell us a bit more about the fellows program? And I know that there's a new cohort opening soon. So yeah, curious to hear more about what the program is, what a fellow does, and who you're looking for to join it.
Right. So, the idea for the fellows was, look, we don't have a ton of money, and we could spend all our money on developing these great assets into companies and all that kind of thing. But let's be honest, even with a ton of money and the best people and the best assets, it's a risky business and these things fail. And if you look at what happened in Boston, there are a lot of people doing a lot of things, and a lot of them failed. But then they would pick themselves up and they would start the next thing. And usually their third or fourth time at bat, they would do okay. And that is our idea, that if we train an entrepreneurial fellow on how to do this, how to identify what value is, how to develop it the right way, network them so they have the network of expertise, not just in Illinois, but on the coast, right? To the right consultants and the right BC, etc., then what will happen is we'll create a virtuous cycle of value creation and ecosystem building. So what we wanted to do was take PhDs. We wanted to say, look, you could move to the coast and you could do biotech, and that would be great, but stay here. We'll train you, we'll pay you, and then you'll give back, right? So we'll pay you for 2 years full time. We'll train you on how to do this. We'll network you. You'll learn all kinds of things, but we're looking for you to give a commitment back to Illinois. And I say Illinois because we have great universities. I want to include the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in that. It's only 2 hours away. It has the #4 computer science department in the world, #5 engineering department. They're amazing, and we consider them part of our innovation community. So we're saying, look, we're going to network you to these universities. You're going to be able to figure out where innovation is coming from, and you're going to figure out how to take those assets and turn them into potential companies, understanding that most of them will not make it, right? 97% of them will not make it. And that's one of the reasons why in our program, we're not looking for postdocs or PhDs to bring their favorite technology here. We're like, just come in. You guys are on our bench. Whatever comes through, you're going to look at. Most of it will not be good, but that's how you learn. And so those are the types of people that we're looking for. And we're looking for them to have a commitment to Illinois.
So I think it's great that you provide a stipend during this program because it gives
it's a
aspiring entrepreneurs. Sorry?
It's a salary. It's $85,000 a year.
There you go.
With development money as well, computer money, etc. And so we think we have to, because the time scale of company creation in biotech is not short.
And it's basically startup capital, right? You allow people to, make sure that they can eat while they're
Yep.
and
Yep.
live well while starting a company.
Well, to be fair, most of the time that they spend with us, they're not starting a company. They're evaluating. So what they do, we ask professors for their ideas. Give us your letter of intent, just like a venture firm. No, we are not a venture firm. We analyze the technology. We probably have about the same hit rate, and we will do extensive diligence into the technology. And that is what we train the fellows to do. If we fund up to $250,000, we will fund with a very clear, this is the go, no go experiment. And the fellows will also project manage that. So they get operational experience as well. And the other thing that they do is we have them extern with local companies. And so when we first started this program, we took our first fellows, I think in 2022. There just wasn't enough stuff to be like, yeah, we should turn this into a company. It wasn't going fast enough. But after now in 2025, we have, I think, a large enough pipeline that we are starting to see fellows being able to take things out and turn them into companies.
Got it. So it's not about necessarily starting a company during the program. It's about learning the skills of how do you approach it, what is an attractive technology for a company, getting exposure to other companies via externships so that they can learn the key skills so that they can eventually start their own company if they'd like.
And the network, which I think is really important.
Absolutely. And yeah, and I was like, going back to that point that you talked about earlier, I think, certainly can say this from my experience in medical school, networking is definitely not talked about or touched on much. And I'm sure very similar for you and your PhD, that to the point you were making, it's more unusual to, have multiple co-first authors and to learn how to do informational interviews and how to network. And that sounds like it's a critical component of the program to learn from people who've been there before, who can share their experiences with you.
Huge, right? So if one of the things that I think is like, I'm always trying to ferret out is what are the best CROs that will do this, this particular assay for cheap, but as good, right? And we actually have a venture board. So before we make write a large check, which for us is $250,000, we'll take a full investment thesis in front of our venture board and present it to them and get their feedback. Not, it's not binding for them, but just so that we can have conviction that there's a VC somewhere that says, yeah, if you get it to this point, I would be interested in a pre-seed meeting. And connecting our fellows to that board and making them understand this is how venture thinks is vital if they are going to become entrepreneurs.
It almost sounds like entrepreneurial, grad school in a way.
Yeah, that's
You
what it
you
is.
learn all the tools to build the entrepreneurial toolkit
Yep,
in biotech.
that's what it is. You said it better than me.
Fantastic. So one of the most important aspects of the CBC programming is that it encourages diversity and recruits underrepresented fellows. Can you tell us a bit more about that ethos and how you're planning on continuing to support underrepresented fellows in biotech?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I know there's so much contention around the word diversity. And let's be honest, diversity can mean many different things. Let's take away all of the current connotations and let's just talk about diversity of thought. And I think this is something that I have encountered again and again in my career, that when you bring a group of people together that think differently than each other, great things can happen. And I think that was, and we were joking about this before, you started taping, right? But like I was a woman in investment banking for multiple years, right? Like you you sometimes are like, gosh, I'm the only person in the room that looks like me. And sometimes that's actually not great. Like, let's say when you're working on something for, you know, premature delivery, right? And you're the only person in the room who has delivered a baby, right? Like, you just have, you need to be able to have people who have walked different paths and who know different things. And that was actually one of the reasons why I did quit my job in 2019. Listen, again, shout out to Jonathan Gertler, one of the most amazing bosses ever, built an amazing company. I miss those guys every day, some of them not as much. Um, and they were actually wonderful. But what I felt in 2019, and one of the reasons why I kind of jumped at the chance to build in Chicago, is I was like, listen, Boston's amazing. But honestly, I go to one client and I see the people that were at my old client who just moved over like a week. And there's a lot of similar ideas. And what I really liked about Chicago was um, there are not. Right? Just like who would have thought in this day and age with so much networking and internet and all that kind of thing, there's still really different ways of thinking in different institutions and in different geographies. And that's what was really exciting to me. Because I go back to, like what was the golden age of what we think of biotech right now when people are like, let's make CAR Ts, right? It's crazy ideas. And you need to be able to have that. So that's how I think of diversity, and especially in a place like Chicago, where for so many reasons, its particular history, I think less than 50% of the population self-identify as white, right? So you want people from different walks and different places and different educational backgrounds and all that kind of thing to be able to really come together and share ideas. And that is the value of the CBC.
That makes a lot of sense. And, to the point that you're saying, diversity shouldn't be contentious. There is a lot of research supporting that diverse teams perform better, right? To the point that you're mentioning, that people with different perspectives, who can legitimately challenge an idea from a different way of thinking, can help sharpen that idea at the end of the day, even if it does go through. So, people who authentically disagree on something can help actually come to a more robust conclusion at the end of the day.
But also diversity of like just diversity of expertise. I mean, one of our best fellows was the material science fellow, right? Like she didn't know any biology, and had been trying to avoid it for years. And being able to have somebody with a material science background was like really, really powerful. And the way that she structured the problems, the way that she thought about things, it was just incredibly powerful. And I always go back to, you really want somebody from a different walk. I think one of the reasons why I do what I do is because I live in Chicago, but I sort of professionally grew up in Boston. I think that that's, again, quite powerful. And I always go back to like the molecular biology revolution was basically waged by physicists, right? That is the type of like diversity does not need to just mean your cultural and your ethnic background or what your skin color looks like. It's what you studied and where you came from and where you went to school. And there's so many different things.
Yeah, many different layers to diversity that all have different merits to them. So yeah, I want to talk on something perhaps slightly controversial, but just for our audience, many companies have been slashing specifically DEI programs, which are focused. They're not focused on diversity of thought, right? They're focused on diversity, equity, inclusion programs. I think today on the day of recording, we heard about Accenture cutting their program. A lot of big tech companies have cut their programs. So would like to hear more about, how CBC thinks about all these changes. I mean, we've heard a theme, but just want to hear a little bit more on that and how you think about, the recent cuts in DEI programs broadly.
I mean, honestly, I I don't think about what Accenture's doing, and I don't think about those things. Stuff comes in vogue and out of vogue, and that's what they do. But what I think about is our goal, which is, we're trying to build an ecosystem here. We need everything we have. We need every advantage that we have. And regardless of what anyone says, there's actually no consensus on exactly what it takes to build a biotech ecosystem. If there was, I think we would run down that checklist. And so, what we're going to need is as many smart people together to think through how to do it. And that is how I think about diversity and what it takes when you're trying to do something new.
That makes a lot of sense, and glad to hear that CBC is staying the course and bringing in fellows from different, ethnic
Let,
backgrounds
let
and
me
diversity of thought, like you mentioned earlier too.
let me say another thing, right, which I
Please.
think is really powerful. So again, I go back to the fact that, I want to be building lean companies. I think that, and especially COVID showed, and I think it's to our advantage, that we could build, a shingle here in Chicago, but we could have a CSO in San Francisco or Boston. The fact that we can have this distributed model also means that we can have companies in the rural parts of Illinois. So Illinois is 13 million, 12 or 3, I should know this, 12 or 13 million people, of which 3 million, maybe 5 million in the greater Chicago metro area. But we have a vast state that has lots of rural areas too. And so when I talk about diversity and inclusion, I mean that as well. There are, when people think about diversity and inclusion, they think about, underrepresented minorities, but there's a rural population that, for different reasons, has exactly the same issues and has been left behind in the all of the tech revolution. And I think that's a huge thing that could be accomplished by thinking differently and bringing in diverse teams.
Yeah, and it makes sense that working with companies in rural areas and training people from rural areas also has a lot of value to bring to the fore for the companies and technologies that you're ultimately helping spin out. So, on a lighter note, as we get here to the end, just curious, outside of biotech and outside of work, what are your passions? What do you enjoy?
What do I enjoy? I love television. So yeah, no, I'm not a very exciting person. What I love to do is watch my favorite shows like Silicon Valley, which some people might say is a documentary. Um,
Getting back to the deep tech and tech roots.
deep tech and tech roots. I like to say, like, whenever I teach my fellows things, I'm like, well, this is season 2, episode 3 of Silicon Valley. Don't take a large term sheet if you don't have to. There are so many lessons there. So I very much enjoy television. I have a 16-year-old, so I enjoy making him cringe, which apparently is the right word. And I'm a very avid reader with incredibly eclectic tastes. So I will read anything from, let's see, what am I reading right now? I'm reading a history of urban planning in New York City, but I've also been known to rock some incredibly embarrassing romance novels. So that's the beauty of the Kindle. You never know what I'm reading.
Runs the full gamut, and appreciate the eclectic take. And fantastic speaking with you. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to the Nucleate audience. We'll include links for the Entrepreneurial Fellows Program and for the Institute for folks who want to learn more.
Can I just say one other plug for the Entrepreneurial Fellow Program? We'll take anyone from anywhere in America as long as they have a good reason and a good story for why they want to stay and build in Illinois. We got 47 applications from 20 different institutions the last class, and we're looking for more this time.
Wonderful. Thanks again for joining us on the podcast today, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Thanks for listening to the Nucleate Podcast. Be sure to subscribe if you'd like to keep up with future episodes. See you next time.